Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Traveling While Black event at Sundance. So this event is organized by our subscriber events team. We do 250 events around the world to support our journalism and to bring our journalism closer to all of you. So today we have a very special event around the OpDoc Traveling While Black. It is the 300th OpDoc, and for those of you that aren't familiar with OpDocs, OpDocs is the New York Times short documentary series. We have had films in the festival, we've had shorts be all around the world by filmmakers as lauded as the one you're about to meet, including first-time filmmakers. My name is Kathleen Lingo. I was the executive producer of OpDocs for many years. I'm now the editorial director for film and television. This Traveling While Black is a project years in the making, and actually the first OpDoc I ever worked on was by the director of Traveling While Black, Roger Ross Williams. It was called Gospel of Intolerance, and it was related to his feature God Loves Uganda. Roger is a two-time Academy Award-nominated director. He's also the first Black man to win an Oscar for directing for his short documentary Music by Prudence. He is on the board of governors of the Academy for the Doc Branch, and his film Life Animated that premiered here 2 years ago won 3 Emmy Awards. Traveling While Black is a project that Roger's been working on for 8 years. I've been involved with it for, I think, the last 3. And today we're going to have a conversation between Roger and Brent Staples. Brent is someone that I got to know working in opinion. He's worked on the editorial board of the New York Times for over 30 years, covering race, culture, and politics. Brent is an award-winning author. His memoir, Parallel Time, won the Anisfield Wolf Book Award, and his essays are required reading at colleges and universities around the country. Traveling While Black is a VR film that is in the festival, and I just want to thank the partners who brought that film together, Oculus, Felix and Paul Studios, who co-directed the film along with Roger, and some of the people who made it possible, including Sundance, the MacArthur Foundation, TFI, ITVS, and the NEH. So I'm about to invite our speakers up for a conversation, but a programming note. On your seats, there are index cards where you are invited to put your questions down, and at a certain point, the ushers will come by and read them. So without further ado, I would like to invite Roger Ross Williams and Brent Staples to the stage. Thank you all so much for being here.
Wow, nice turnout.
Thank you all for coming out. My first time in Sundance, my first time in Utah. It's very pretty. I would like to say, start by saying something I often say on my Twitter feed, if you follow me, and to students and to people who ask me about the importance of history in writing. History is the only education. Everything else is just training. If you do not know the history of a problem or the history of an idea, you can't grasp it, evaluate it, or actually view it critically. When I viewed this film, hi, how are you? Good to see you. You look marvelous, by the way. When I viewed this film, I went back to my office and I thought of how I could write an essay that would serve as a companion piece to it. And if you've got a copy of the New York Times today, that essay takes up the entire editorial page of the New York Times. And I wanted to also say to people that we often have, we're taught a lot of lies in school, right? And one of them that we hear is that segregation was confined to the South, and that people in the North were the good guys the entire time. So I began this essay with a story of a guy named B. Price Hearst. B. Price Hearst was black. As I described him in this essay, he was one of the Washington 400, the colored 400, which the black elite of Washington was referred to in the early part of the 20th century. He was a graduate of Harvard Medical School. He worked at Freedman's Hospital in Washington. He was driving from, I think it was Montreal, home to Washington, and he stopped in New York City to take 2 hotel rooms for the night that he had confirmed by telegraph. When the clerk at the Prince George Hotel found out that the Dr. Hearst he had assigned the rooms to was black, he turned the family away, Dr. Hearst and his family, into the streets of Manhattan at midnight. Dr. Hearst then drove around Manhattan. He went to 4 separate hotels and was turned away. Normally, a person who experiences that lets the problem go. Dr. Hearst, however, had a sense of himself and who he was. And he sued the hotel, the Prince George Hotel, in 1932, and he won a settlement against them. And it was it's an unheralded settlement. You don't find it in history books, but it was crucial because it put hotels in New York City on notice that there were Negroes with money, and that those Negroes would in fact sue if they, if they rented rooms, if they booked rooms and they were not given them. Dr. Hearst, this issue of not being able to get hotel rooms, black people who embraced automobile travel in the early 20th century did so to escape aspects of Jim Crow segregation. Oftentimes they were confined to all black train cars on the railroads. And in many situations, those train cars were the smoking cars. So Negroes, women in particular, really abhorred being pushed back into the smoking cars, pushed back into filthy Jim Crow cars. And so black people embraced automobile travel to escape that. What they found out, however, was that the reach of segregation, the reach of Jim Crow, was far more vast than they had imagined. They found, for example, that there were towns across the United States, hundreds of towns in Illinois, in California, all over. There were sundown towns that had posted signs that said, Negroes cannot be in these towns after dark. These towns weren't all in the South. They found that they had to relieve themselves in ditches by the roadside because they could not use bathrooms in service stations where they bought gasoline. They found that they were pulled over for driving while black. A familiar phrase? Pulled over for driving while black for no other reason than they were black, often accused of stealing their cars, of criminal activity. So the ordeal of these people has been largely forgotten until quite recently. And this, by the way, is not the ordeal that you saw in the highly acclaimed feature film, Green Book.
Quiet.
So, Roger, tell me.
Well, I just want to say something about the Hollywood version of the Green Book. Brent's article in the op-ed in the New York Times today is the real story of Victor Green and gives him his due of what he did for the African American community. So thank you for your research and for writing this article and really focus on the real Green Book.
Let's just say, Victor Green died in 1892 to 1960. And the year that Dr. Hearst sued for being turned away from the Prince George Hotel in Manhattan was the first year that Victor created the first Green Book. It was a guide to hotels guest houses, gas stations, restaurants that would, accept Negroes and their money and the growing middle class. And so very little is known about Victor. Very little, very mysterious guy. But I'm on the trail of some things. And I do think that this case of Hearst in New York City was one of the contributing factors to him, pushing him to do this. So tell me,
I think you need to write a book about Victor Green.
Oh, okay.
No one's written a book, Brent. You should
That's
write
true.
it.
No one has. But how did you come in touch with, one more thing before I ask you the question. Roger's film takes place in a venerable Washington establishment called Ben's Chili Bowl.
And Virginia Ali and her daughter are right here in the front row. Could you stand up, Virginia?
The owners of the...
87 years old, 66 years. She's run that business. You guys.
And the film opens with an absolutely electrifying, for me, is, was it Sandra? I have her name in the
Reverend Sandra Tisdale.
Sandra Butler Tisdale, sitting at the counter of the Chili Bowl. And she narrates how growing up in Washington, in segregated Washington, she was not allowed to try on clothing in department stores. And Negroes in some places into the 1960s, were disallowed from trying on clothing before they bought them. And as I explained in the article, part of it, the segregationist shop owner said the idea, well, Negroes are not very clean but I have to tell you, if you knew anyone from the colored 400 in Washington, I mean, that the idea that you could find a speck of dirt on any of them anywhere, anytime, that was deeply humiliating to them. But the actual underpinnings of Jim Crow had it that any object that came in touch with the skin of a black person became contaminated and was then unsuitable for use by any one way. And keep in mind that underpinning of Jim Crow, we associate it with the South. But keep in mind, as Winthrop Jordan and C. Van Woodward have pointed out, Jim Crow was created in the North and then exported to the South. So this is the electrifying moment when she's sitting there and she says, we weren't allowed to try on clothing. Why did you start with that?
I think, Sandra, first of all, she's a dynamic, amazing character. So as a documentarian, as soon as I met her, I was like, she has to be sort of our narrator through the piece. And her, she just tells stories in such a powerful way and so when she tells the story of having to pee in a field on the side of the train because they couldn't use the bathroom, when she tells the story of being called the N-word as a little girl in a shop, it's just so powerful. And what we wanted to do with that is the reason it's night and the reason that she's sitting alone is that it's a moment to reflect, to absorb the information, to absorb what you're learning. So the piece, I don't know, how many of you have seen the piece? Oh, a lot, okay. So the piece, you are meeting these characters from the community and you're in a booth having a conversation with them. But what Reverend Sandra does is she allows you at night to have that sort of reflective moment to think about and just hear her in the back of your head think about what pain that she suffered. She was beautiful at expressing her pain and the pain that we all go through and that we all kind of keep under the surface as black people living in America. Because when we step out our door, we never know what's going to happen? We could be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Being pulled over, especially as a black man. You keep your hands on the dashboard. You are careful. You don't make sudden moves. This is the reality of life for us.
It's true. I have a joke at the office at the Times, and oftentimes when someone from government, I talk to government officials often on the phone, and I keep a calm voice, and they say, "You sound very calm," and they say, "How are you today?" I said, "I'm very mellow." And they say, "You couldn't be mellow because you have a real frantic job." I said, "No, you don't understand. When a black man over 6 feet tall raises his voice, people call the police."
Oh. They do.
So I keep it right there at the FM level. So basically, what you see unfolding in your exposition of the Green Book era, you see unfolding a continuity. Is it Sandra? Sandra who says, people think that this ended. That basically in 20s and 30s, black people were writing in black newspapers. You have to go back to the African American, the Norfolk Journal and Guide, you have to go to the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender. You see that the struggle of the black middle class at that time was simply to move in a black body through space without attracting harm, without incurring harm. It's a simple thing, to traveling while black, moving through space with a black skin was an invitation to people to abuse, harm, or perhaps even kill you. So in your film, you see the continuity of that, from the late 19th century into the present, don't you?
It still is, yeah, exactly. I think now with, because of social media, we are all too familiar with videos of black men being shot and killed in their cars on the streets. This is something that actually we've come to accept. It's just part of life. It's all over Facebook. You go on Facebook and there are tons of videos, and it's become part of life. And so what I wanted to do is connect that part in our history, the past to the present, to show how much has not changed, and what are we going to do about it? And the experience, I hope, allows people to start a conversation about it. And if you're, this week has been extraordinary because watching black people watch this is a total different experience than watching white people watch this. And one of the first,
how so?
Well, one of the first journalists who watched it was a white woman, and she said to me, "This was the first time I felt like I could come out of my skin and be in a black space and with a black conversation going on around her that she would never be able to be privy to." And it was like an out-of-body experience for her. And I think that was, and I think that was really my goal. I think for black people, it brings up this sort of underlying pain that you carry around, this anger you carry around. And I find that every black person, including myself, the first time that I saw the fully rendered piece, I was I was not only in tears, but I was crying I was really crying. And there have been people who have seen it who just sat there and cried for half an hour, 40 minutes after, because it brings it to the surface.
Now, one of the interesting things, as Roger and I were talking earlier, just getting used to the sound of one of those voices, and, he asked me a question. He said, "What do you think is the interest in this topic now? Why is it that, there's several, there are going to be Green Book projects. So you had the feature film, and you have his story of the true story of the Green Book, and you'll have more. There are going to be documentaries. They're going to go back into the early 20th century, into the childhood of my parents, right? When I say to people that my great-great-grandmother, Somerville Staples, was born in the horrors of slavery, my great-great-grandmother, born in the horrors of slavery, and that her son, my great-grandfather, John Wesley Staples, missed being born a slave by like 60 days. People are astonished, especially poorly educated people, that slavery was that close at hand, right? It's very close at hand in my family, very close. I mean, actually have my great-grandfather's, all of his siblings were born in chains before him. So you see how the nearness of this. Now, when Roger and I were talking this morning, when I saw this, I was watching the scene, I was thinking of my parents in the Philadelphia area taking me back to their ancestral home in rural southwestern Virginia. They drive, right, in the late 50s. I have pictures of myself on the ancestral farm in like the early 50s. And we carried our food, right? And we kids thought it was great because you had a picnic, you had like all your food in the car, and you had your blankets, you can go to sleep if you wanted to, you look out the window if you wanted to. And, only as we grew older did we realize that we did not stop because places would not feed us, because we were black. Would not stop.
And you said that they didn't tell you that. You didn't know that they protected you from that.
Yeah, yeah, they did. My parents, my mother in particular, my mother's still alive. She's turned 87, 88. I once asked her about this, and she said, listen, she said, I knew that all of you sooner or later were going to encounter racism, a virulent form of racism in your life. I didn't want to take anything away from your life by making you fearful of the world. And so, when it came to you, I'd help you explain it. But I was not going to beat you down with the awareness of that when you were a child. As you went out and experienced the world, then we would deal with it, and they never would. What about your parents?
I mean, I had my mother grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, and she also migrated to Philadelphia. And we would go back and visit, and I was a really little kid, and we'd do it in one shot, and she would pack sandwiches and food, and it didn't even cross my mind why we never stopped anywhere, even though, and I think that's because that was something that was just ingrained into her head, that you just did it in one stop. You didn't stop, and even though we could stop at that point, because it was, well, I'm not gonna say what year, but, so it was, my mother was a maid, who cleaned the toilets at a liberal arts college, and she really understood and suffered the pain of segregation, and for me, it took me a long time to really sort of understand what she went through and why she carried around a lot of anger with her, frankly. And it took a while for me to understand where that was coming from and to understand what she had been through, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this piece, because I wanted to create something that is, traditional documentary is, I'm a documentarian. I love traditional 2D documentary, but when you're watching a 2D documentary, even if you're in a theater, the person next to you could be like fiddling with a wrapper or eating some popcorn, or someone has to go to the bathroom and they walk. You're not fully immersed. When you have on a headset, you can't escape. You are trapped in that world, in that environment. There is no escape, and that can only be created in VR.
That's interesting. That really is interesting too. Yeah. Also, one of the things I bring through in the article, and not just to plug the Times or to plug my article, but I think this is very urgent to understand. Oftentimes for modern day people, segregation is reduced to they had to sit on the back of the bus. They had to sit in the Negro car on the train. They couldn't eat in the restaurant. They had to get their food handed out of the back door. These are serious things. I mean, these are serious soul-killing distinctions that are made against you. But at the time Victor was writing the Green Book, Negroes in the South, and not just the South, were dying on the streets after car accidents because ambulances set aside for whites only would not pick them up. There's a case in Atlanta at the Grady Memorial Hospital, well-documented case of a postal worker who was struck by a car, a light-skinned postal worker, struck by a car, and the doctor who hit him carried him to Grady, and they mistakenly put him in the brand new white wing of the hospital. And when his in-laws, who were recognizably black, came to check on him, horror went through the hospital, and they dragged him off the examination table through a rainstorm across the street to the decrepit Negro wing where he died. So, you know, don't ever go away from here, or don't let them reduce segregation to those, you know, Negroes had to sit in the back of the bus, so what? What it was about, every aspect of your life was governed by the color of your skin. And if you had a chronic medical condition and you were traveling south to see your relatives, there are some places you could not go. Atlanta was a place you really couldn't go because they had bad medical care for black people. And you might go to, what town is it? You might go to Tennessee, the area around Meharry, which had a black medical school. You might go someplace where you can, so it dictated every aspect of your life, where you could buy gas, what road you could go on, you know? And for people to say that, well, that was then, this is now, that kind of memory is ingrained, passed down in the psychology of your family and your person, you know? And it is still wounding in a way. So tell me, go ahead.
I was just going to talk a bit about the history of this project. So this project started with Bonnie Nelson Shorts, produced a play. Bonnie's right there. Stand up, Bonnie. She produced a play at the Ford Theater in D.C., starring the late Julian Bond, the late great Julian Bond, playing Victor Green. And Bonnie came to me and said she wanted to do a documentary film, and I was, you know, and I was a little sort of, you know, I wanted to try something different, sort of tired of the format, especially if it's a film with like archive and interviews. Right. And so at that time, 8 years ago, I think it was called Transmedia. So I said, oh, let's do it. I think there's this new thing called, let's do a transmedia project. I didn't even know what transmedia was. And I went to the, I think it was the second New Frontier lab. So I went to the New Frontier lab, and I was trying to figure out what was transmedia, and it was all sort of web-based. And that went on for years, and we'd gotten a number of grants from ITVS and the NEH to sort of do this multimedia web-based project. And then about 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, Shari Freelos said to me, you know, you should think about VR for this. And she gave me a grant to a New York Times MacArthur Immersive Journalism Storytelling Grant, long name, to study VR. And I got to immerse myself in the VR space and went down many roads that totally were like kind of dead ends, because I started off thinking I would do it as animation, but I felt disconnected from the material when it's animated. CGI. I tried all these things, and then, you know, when I saw The People's House, which is Felix and Paul's piece, where Barack and Michelle Obama give a tour of the White House, which was very emotional because it was right before they were leaving the White House and what we were heading into. So I was like, this is a beautiful rendering of VR, where real people, and sort of Felix and Paul led me back to my original skill and instincts as a documentary filmmaker to base this in reality and the people from Ben's Chili Bowl and from that community. And Aisha Nadaraja, who is the co-director, and where is she? I don't know where she is, but really put this together in such a beautiful way, and I realized that VR filmmaking is really about emotional storytelling, which is what all filmmaking is.
The other thing you said that it's very crucial, you mentioned earlier too, that, it's not that the Green Book era is that far, is not that much in the past, that people actually lived it. And you get people in your film to talk about living it.
Who are all Bonnie's friends.
Yeah.
Bonnie really, brought that community out. It was like because what's amazing about Ben's Chili Bowl is that it had so many. It was the Minnehaha, a black silent movie theater. Then it was a African American pool hall, and then 66 years ago became Ben's Chili Bowl. But it has a community of people there who, and there's even a historian who does, I think it's weekly storytelling. Events there. So the community comes and tells stories in the tradition of the African American community. So here you have this incredibly vibrant, rich community to draw from. So it was not hard to find just incredible people with incredible stories to tell.
And yes, that's true, and that really comes through. And also, I commend all of you really to what you go into, and what I tapped into too, was the history of the black middle class in Washington. I mean, Washington itself, when Reconstruction collapsed and failed, and black Republicans fled the South, they fled to Washington because it was the place where they could take refuge, where they could build a middle class and a black elite community. And it was called, Mary Church Terrell called it in the late 1900s, it was a Negro man's paradise, where you could work, buy homes, and sort of strive and create wealth. Quickly in the turn of the 20th century, that changed a lot when Woodrow Wilson came in office and reinstated segregation in the workforce, drove out black people out of the postal services, management positions, and basically eviscerated the black middle class. So they were very defensive. So your film, in a way, is a window onto that too. It's a window onto how black people were trying to keep their dignity in the face of federally sponsored racism, segregation, and disenfranchisement.
Yeah.
That element runs right through it. And when the Reverend begins to speak about that, you feel that current in it too.
Yeah.
And
it was really important in the sort of storytelling to ramp up from, threat situations like Cortland Cox, who was a civil rights, was involved in the civil rights and the stories that he had up into the point where it was death. And death happens in the present time with Tamir Rice. And Tamir Rice's mother, for the first time, really in this piece, talks about what she went through in detail and the pain she went through. And for me, it was important that people understand that traveling while black is not about just being in a car or being on a train, that you step outside of your door and on your front porch, you could be killed. We know this from Henry Louis Gates, recently Ving Rhames. I mean, so Tamir here is a kid who just went across the street to a playground, and the police, who are oath-bound to protect him, took his life. And he was considered evidence. She wasn't allowed to touch his body. She wasn't allowed to hold her child. And what she suffered, and she said America robbed her of her kid. And that happened now. Right.
And so that's what I was saying earlier about how the continuity in the film. I was surprised where you were going with that. When I was used to saying straight historical pieces. But when I saw Tamir Rice's mother sitting in the chili bowl and explaining that some kids run to her door and say, your son's been shot, And she's saying, well, no, my son's not shot. He just went across to play in the park. That couldn't possibly be. He's shot. And they keep telling her, she says, no, that's not really possible. But you see the continuity. And I was trying to sort of figure out the kind of axiomatic way to say it. But what you do here is you show kind of the origins of American devaluation of black life and how that devaluation morphs into other forms and continues to march forward. That's what you show. Okay, we're going to, if you have written questions, you might want to pass them. Will they pass them to the center or the ends?
Before we do questions.
No, they're just passing them. I'm just telling them to pass the marks.
Okay. I just want to say something. When I sort of got the grant and I started to explore VR, I looked around for a producer who understood the experience and could take this journey with me, and that was Jahan Robinson, who was sitting over there. and Jahan and I saw so much VR, went down so many like dead end roads. We were, and I think Elena from Oculus says we were VR dating. We had to break up with people. It was painful, but we got there. And Jahan is really the one who said, Felix and Paul, that's it. They're the ones. They're the ones. And Felix and Paul are just absolutely brilliant.
That's what experimentation is, though. I mean, anything new is dead ends. Anything new. I mean. Yeah. In any narrative, you're trying any difficult narrative, you have to start out and abandon them, And you're right, that makes it no less painful, but that's part of the experience.
Yes, it is.
So, what in terms of have you seen so far of the public response to this?
Whoa, I wasn't prepared for the public response that I've gotten here. People were. I think the first day when we started showing the piece, the first day was a press day, and I noticed that everyone was weeping into their headsets, and people had to just sort of sit there after experiencing it and just have a moment, and they had to talk to each other about what they experienced, and I was blown away, overwhelmed, just by I think one of the first when this journalist told me that she could come out of her skin, that was like a big moment for me because that was the goal, to watch Black people and to sort of bring that sort of pain to the surface and have a conversation about it was powerful. Yesterday, one of my heroes, Norman Lear, saw it, and he said it was the best VR he's ever seen, and invited me to dinner, and Tessa Thompson saw it yesterday and cried for 40 minutes. I mean, it's just been an amazing experience by people I admire and who believe that this is a much needed conversation as an alternative to the Hollywood lack of conversation.
Well, let's just say this now. We don't want to offend anybody here.
Why not?
The thing about Victor Green, the language, you can go online. Most of they've been digitized, the Green books, at the Schomburg Center, New York Public Library. You can go online, read them. And you will notice that the language itself. So Victor Green writes this. He writes this and publishes this. As Negroes are being turned away from hotels in Manhattan, being killed in the streets and car accidents in the South because Black ambulances won't pick them up. They're being lynched by the score. But the language of the Green Book is itself very even-tempered and low-key. And Victor casts the book. He says, this is so that the Negro can have an authentic guide by which to travel. And he casts the first book. It says in the first book, he says of it that it is merely an assembly of facts, information that will come in handy to the Negro traveler. So he was speaking at two, as the black people often do in America, he was speaking at two levels. He was speaking to white people who had the money to advertise and saying, this is not a flame-throwing book, right? And then he was speaking to black people who were being terrorized in their homes and on the road and saying, this is a way for you to counter racial terrorism on the road. So it is a bivocal thing. You know, it speaks at two different, it speaks, the corporate people were reading and saying, seems clean enough. SO, okay, we'll sell this. Federal government, we'll promote this. So it's really subversive, and it's subversive in two ways. That is the language of it, but also because it shows white America a thing that they never saw at that time, which was pictures of black elites, Negroes with expensive suitcases, and sort of striding to their cars for cross-country trips. So it was subversive in many ways. But one thing I wanted to ask you was, have we reached a time, I mean, historically, there could not be a story in Hollywood that allowed Negroes to be the hero of their own story. That the story always had to be told with some white person as the hero and the intercessor, you know, the rescuer. But you know, we have some films recently that, I mean, the Black Panther's a great film. It's a great hit. You know, we have Moonlighting, right? Yeah, we have
Black Klansman.
yeah, we have things. So are we now at the point that the white audience can empathize with Negroes telling their own story?
No. He said yes. You said something to me. Wait a minute. I wrote this down. You said something to me.
This guy's almost a reporter. He wrote down everything I said today.
No,
and I think he went back and had it typed up too.
I think films, you know, you said white people are accustomed to rationalizing racism, and I think that the Green Book film, the Hollywood film, does that. It's a comfortable way, and it allows you to almost like get off the hook, really. And I think that, you know, in this day and age when black creators are creating incredible works of art, that we still have this shit going on in Hollywood with these kinds of films, these kind of white savior films. And I'm not afraid to say it. So for me, it is so clear with Black Panther and Black Klansman that the audience is there. And people are going to see films by black filmmakers, black creators in droves. And still we get a celebrated film that wins awards that is the furthest thing from that. And I think Hollywood has a long way to go. You know, I'm on the board of governors of the Academy. I am like dealing with this every day.
So don't repeat anything you said.
I'm dealing with this every day, and I see close up when I sit at that table that I'm not a part of Hollywood. I'm a documentarian, but I get to observe Hollywood, and I get to observe in a real way just how cut off from reality those executives, those people at that table are. And for me, you know, my goal, the reason why I am a governor, the reason why I ran for governor is because I have a seat at that table, and I'm gonna use it, and I'm gonna make my voice heard. Because the Academy, thank you. So we're gonna change Hollywood. It's changing, you know, I think that, you know, obviously it has a long way to go, but we're making strides there.
One of the questions, is there a way to measure the impact your film will have in making positive change? If we could get everybody to see your film, what do you think the net effect would be?
Well, I would hope we would at least begin to have conversations around this. I would hope that there's empathy for our Black experience in America. I would hope that, you know, in a way, this I would hope, one of the ideas behind it was creating sort of a modern day Green Book. The Green Book was really crowdsourcing of its time. There's, targeting hotspots in America that we need to focus on, whether it's legislation or retraining the police in that community. There's a million, and I think those ideas need to start to be discussed, and we need to start to connect to politicians. I would hope to show it to politicians, to take it down to Congress, to have those dialogues and get people who are brilliant to start to come up with solutions and figure out how we're going to end this shit.
Well, I would say we talked earlier about one thing that hasn't come up, and that was the impact of social media on the discussion of race and racism in America. I can tell you that in the seat where I sit at the New York Times, and having been a journalist in America for 40 years, quite a long time, I noticed a demarcation of change happening around 2013-14. The rise of social media, Facebook, especially Twitter. Twitter, as you know, or you don't know, is really black inflected in terms of, and what I mean by that is black people are overrepresented among those who use it. And so you begin to see something like the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, right? And the sudden response of people to that, and Tamir Rice, and the gentleman in Minnesota, and Ms. Bland, you begin to see a kind of a huge sort of outpouring, and suddenly you saw kind of what, I'm loath to call it that, you suddenly began to see what a black perspective on these events looks like. And I think this has had an impact on police departments. If you notice now, a lot of times when some black person is murdered by a police officer or bludgeoned by them unfairly, that more often than not, the person is being fired, being instantly sort of put on suspension, because suddenly people are aware of the impact of other eyes being on this. And it's interesting that suddenly, but black people were admitted into the media, in through the media door, through this, the alternative method. Their voices came in through an alternative method. And also, by the way, this to some extent affects network executives too, because as the slivers of the audience gets more and more narrow, everyone's looking for some kind of advantage, right? So don't you think that social media has changed that debate to some extent?
Yeah, absolutely. It has, but I'm not sure it translates into enough action. Police officers are still acquitted of murdering black men, and that seems to happen on a regular basis. And I think that I think in the private sector, it has more of an effect, because in the private sector, if you see someone who's yelling racial epithets at someone and it goes viral, and they get fired from their job. Right. That happens pretty frequently. Right. There can be a groundswell of social media that can start a tide against someone who is a complete straight up racist. Mm-hmm. So that's great. Government police officers, I feel like there's still ways to go with them, and I think that far too often juries acquit those guys.
I think you're right, but let's take a minute. I lived for many years in Chicago, which had the fearsome, murderous police department, and when a police officer pulled you over in Chicago, I'm talking about you feared for your life, and you knew that this could end up with you being dead, even if it was your tail light was broken or your license was expired. You knew it, and you basically did what you could to get out of that alive, right? And in Chicago, they had a state commission that verified that the police department had engaged in a reign of torture between the late 70s and the up into the 90s, snatching people off black men off the street, shocking them with cattle prods, beating them with rubber and all that kind of thing. Yet, we had the conviction for murder of a police officer in the case of Laquan McDonald. When that conviction came, when that officer was convicted, there's a question now about his sentencing. But when he was convicted, as an experienced reporter and long cynical, I looked up from my desk at the screen and I couldn't quite believe it, because in Chicago it was all the time open season on Negroes. So in general, I agree with you, but I think this is kind of also another example of what you were showing in your film, the continuity of the idea, the long continuity of the idea of the disposability of black life, and how it went through all other areas, right? And how it morphs into new forms. So the person who asked the question about social media, that was your answer. Okay. Bonnie's aim when she started this was to show that, yes, things have changed, but yet they have not changed. And what's your question there?
Who wrote that? Is that, did you?
It's not my question.
No. I was asking what the actual question is. Is yours just a statement that things have not changed, or do you want to? No? Okay.
Bonnie's aim?
Yeah.
Was your aim?
That's not my question.
It was mine.
Oh! So, explain.
My point, Roger,
This is Bonnie's
and Brad,
husband.
was that white America in general feels that after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, et cetera, that things are fine. And her aim in starting all this was to show, yes, there have been changes, but in fact, there's a whole new wave of other offenses that white America either knows nothing about or chooses to ignore.
Well, I would say this is like, and not to keep quoting it because sometimes I wear it out. That the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. It does, and I'll tell you, because for black people in America, and I thinking about my great-great-grandma, for black people in America had to get up in Virginia, in the old Confederacy, and walk down the street and get off the sidewalk when a white person came before them, and who knew that they could be killed with impunity for even looking a white person in the eye or speaking back to them. There are people in my family, who can tell you about that. And my uncles, the last of whom just died a few years ago, my Uncle McKinley died at 97. And they came up in the rural South. And my uncles, they were all gun-toting men. And because they came up in that period of time. Now, they criticized my generation, because one of my uncles, Paul, said to me, he said, if I had the life you have without the obstacles I faced in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, I'd be president of the United States. But in the end, right, a black person did become president of the United States.
Well,
You see. So basically, it's true. I mean, I think to get at the real thing here is that there are manifestations of racism in the corporate context. There's manifestations of racism in the office context. There's manifestations of racism all around that are so nuanced that people can look past them until you begin to point it out to them. You see what I'm saying? And that's what I think the kind of thing that you're doing here. I mean,
So are you. You're working at the Times, and you would think that the New York Times is this liberal bastion of people who are well informed. But I know that you told me you you are educating people there that work there.
Now, I can't tell tales out of school. But
saying.
no, it's, part of it is if you the Times is an institution like any other. It's a corporate institution. I mean, its roots go back to 1851, and I sit at a desk, and on the wall I see the pictures of all the editors that ever were in the history of the New York Times. I see them all.
What does that look like?
And, well, it looks like, of course they're all white. They're all white, and there's only one woman in the whole history of the whole thing. But I'm writing a piece now, and I shouldn't have said that, but it's true. But, I think that you get to you have these periods in history where you do get a little jump in progress, that certain insights coalesce, and you do get a jump, And I think we're even in this time when you can look at the rise of neo-Nazi, of what I call, one of my essays, easy listening Nazism in America. The rise of easy listening Nazism in America under this president itself is a reaction to the fact that African Americans are sort of breaking out and doing more things and becoming more visible in many more places. That itself is a reaction to that. So you have to look at it that way. And forgive me for talking so much, but it's a subject that I think about a lot. And we want to thank you all for coming, and now we're going to drink and schmooze.
Yes, my favorite part. Thank you guys for coming, and go to New Frontier and see Traveling While Black.
Thank you all so much for coming. There was a question of how can you watch Traveling While Black? You can watch Traveling While Black in the Oculus store or on the New York Times at nytimes.com/TWB. And then I want to do a couple shout outs. I would love to thank the film team for Traveling While Black, Bonnie Nelson Schwartz, who's been a fearless champion of this project. And I also just want to note that we are hoping to do more Traveling While Black events. So keep in touch. Aisha Nataraja, who has been a tireless worker in making this happen. Felix and Paul, the co-directors, who brought the beauty and technical genius to make the film look as amazing as it does. Producer Jahan Robinson. Yelena Rachinsky from Oculus, who brought this to happen in a way that no one else could when we really needed someone at the finish line. So thank you, Yelena, for your unwavering support. And then I'd like to make a couple shout outs to the New York Times. Lindsay Krause, the amazing Lindsay Krause from OpDocs, who is the first person in the world to ever fact check a VR film, among other things. Beth Weinstein, Carmen from the New York Times subscriber events. They have another event coming up February 12th in Los Angeles, so check our Times events website to see more. I would also just like to do a quick shout out to Holly Harnish, Libby Panzer, and Michelle Gray, my other colleagues for the Times, and thank you all so much for being here. This was an amazing event. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Brent. You hit it out of the park. This was fabulous. Thank you.